Today's episode is going to be about hi-fi terminology. So what exactly determines sound quality? When you're buying a pair of speakers, what attributes of the speaker system are you looking for to determine its quality? So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to tell you about what these different attributes are. I'm going to go through them one by one and spend a little bit of time providing you the definitions of these terms. The term I'm going to start with, and to me, it is one of the principal determinants of good sound quality, and that is soundstage. And the reason I say that is soundstage, to me, is something that makes the speaker system sound more realistic, more true to life, because soundstage is how your system sounds and how it paints the image of 3D space. So a speaker system with good soundstage would sound wider, taller and deeper, giving you a more 3D like sound. So the better the soundstage is, the more you're going to feel like you're actually there, part of the audience, listening to the live performance. Another attribute of sound quality is imaging. Imaging determines how easily you can pick out certain attributes within a stereo image. For example, if let's say we're watching a live orchestral performance and then we have the violin section over here, the first violins, the second violins, over here we have the cellists. How easily can we pinpoint the locations of those different elements of the orchestra? Now, in modern day music, where we don't necessarily listen to live recordings, good imaging will tell us exactly how the producer mixed certain attributes of the recording. Now, it's important to realize that in order for you to have good imaging, really, imaging and soundstage, our first point, they're quite well intertwined. For example, you would need to have a fairly decent soundstage in order to have good imaging as well. And it works the other way around too. So if you want a realistic, believable soundstage, you're going to need fantastic imaging too. Our next term is resolution or transparency. And what this does, it allows us to see deeper into the recording and expose all the tiny bits of information, all the audible information in the recording. So to test this yourself, you should try a few speakers or headphones if you're into headphones and listen to acoustic music specifically. For example, how much detail can you hear when a guitar string is plucked, or when a violinist changes bowing from up bow to down bow? How much of that detail can you pick out in the recording? Some speakers will show you more than others. What you'll notice is when a speaker system has very good resolution, very good detail, you will be able to pick out more texture, more detail within a note. So having a very detailed hi-fi, high fidelity system is a very, very important thing. As hi-fi enthusiasts and music lovers, we must be careful with resolution, because the thing about resolution is the more of it you have, the more imperfections the speaker is able to show you about the recording. If a recording isn't produced very well, or perhaps your sound system is of higher quality than the sound system that the producer was using to mix the audio in the first place, so in some instances your system is able to better resolve the minute details of a recording than the producers. And this is especially true in the modern era, because more and more people are able to set up their own home studios because of the way technology has evolved. So if your speaker system doesn't sound particularly good on a specific recording, chances are the recording quality, the production quality, isn't very good. And you can test this if you test it across a few different speakers and that recording consistently doesn't sound very good, then you'll know it's down to the recording itself. However, some speakers will still make better of a recording than others, so we have to be very careful about seeing too deep into the mix. Our next term is transient response. To put transient response simply, it determines the speaker's ability to play a note and start the note and stop the note exactly when it's meant to do it. In poor quality systems, transient response is especially going to be poor, and certain notes will sound quite muddy and quite laggy, and it can give the impression that the recording is kind of out of time or very sloppy. Good transient response, on the other hand, will translate more into very good rhythm and timing, and the leading edges of notes will sound very precise. The next definition is timbre. Timbre relates to the certain characteristics of a sound. Now, I don't want to delve too deeply into music theory, but let's say, for example, the note A, which has a specific frequency of 440 Hertz. We could play that 440 Hertz as a sine wave, but we could also play that exact 440 Hertz frequency on a different instrument, like the violin, for example, or like the piano, for example. Now you might notice all of these are exactly the same note, that's 440 Hertz, but they sound different on every instrument. And even on specific instruments, an instrument can sound different from instrument to instrument. For example, 3 or 4 pianos, they won't sound identical to each other because they all have different timbre. And that comes down to the harmonic frequencies within that note. So we define timbre as the characteristic of a specific instrument, and your hi-fi system will have a specific timbre too. The next term is dynamic range. Put simply, dynamic range is the difference between the maximum volume your speaker can play and the minimum volume that your speaker can play. So the greater the distance between those two things, the greater the dynamic range. So why is dynamic range important? Because the dynamics of a piece of music is what determines how musical it sounds. It's one of the major attributes of music is dynamics. So if we could play a certain passage very loud and immediately go from loud to very soft, music like this is more engaging and more fun to listen to. Whereas on the other hand, if we have a speaker system that doesn't have much dynamic range, then the speaker system is going to sound a little bit more flat and a little bit more boring to listen to. The next term is frequency extension, and this you'll find on a speaker system's specification sheet especially. And what it is, it shows us essentially the bandwidth of the speaker system. For example, how low a speaker can play versus how high a speaker can play. So the highest notes and the lowest notes, the difference between the two of those things. So basically, a speaker system with a large frequency extension, it just tells us how many notes that speaker system is able to play. The next term is tonal balance. And again, this is a very, very important term because it's one of those characteristics of a speaker system that it has to make sense to your ears and your listening environment. Tonal balance is the balance between the bass frequencies, the mid frequencies, the mid-range frequencies, and the highest treble frequencies. And when these are in balance, the speaker system will have a more natural sound. And sometimes when a speaker system is off balance, we'll give it names. So for example, we'll use terms like warm or bright. So a warm sounding tonal balance is when the speaker system favors more towards perhaps the bass and less of the treble. So it's kind of like this. That's more of a warm sounding system. So what speakers would we generally class as warm sounding speakers? Now this is just a generalization. Obviously every speaker is individual, but just these are assumptions based on previous models I've seen and certain brands' house sound, as it were. So warm sounding speakers could be Wharfedale, classic tannoy models, ELAC is another one, Dynaudio is another one, Proac is another one, and on the more extreme end of that scale, we'd have something more like Harbuth, for example. Now on the other hand, we can have bright sounding speakers, and bright shows us more of a tonal balance that's skewed more towards the higher frequencies. So what are some brands, house sound, that typically could be regarded as bright? Well, we have B&W, Bowers & Wilkins, typically sound brighter. Focal is another brand. Again, they tend to err on the brighter side of neutral. Monitor Audio, again, from the samples I've heard, they always seem to be more on the bright side. Q Acoustics is another one. Mission, PMC, Revell is another one. The German brand Teufel is another one. And on the extreme end, I would say we'd go for more like a brand like Klipsch. They seem to be more on the brighter side. Kef is another one, although I would say Kef might be regarded as mildly bright. Now neutral is essentially what we are kind of aiming at, what we're shooting for, only if we were in an anechoic chamber. Of course, everybody's room acoustics makes a difference, but neutral in most cases is what we are looking for. Some say that neutral sounding speakers sound better and more realistic. What are some more neutral brands? Well, I would say there is no such thing as a completely neutral brand. I think all of them kind of err on the side of bright or warm, but some brands, just picking it out of the hat, would be Dali, for example. Acoustic Energy, I would say, is another one. XTZ is a European direct-to-manufacturer brand. That would be another one. And PSB is another one. So remember, this is just a generalization. There will be a lot of speaker models from certain brands that don't always follow the same formula. So you must check this first. It's more of a rule of thumb than anything else. Another thing that you must take into account, and I've said it a few times before, your room acoustics. So you might buy one of these brands because I've said, oh, it tends to be neutral. However, your room acoustics might spike certain frequencies. You might take a pair of speakers and certain frequencies in your room sound overpronounced. And then now, if these were the treble frequencies, for example, we'd now say that this speaker system sounds bright. So you must match your speaker system to your room. And you must make sure that you do that way round. You don't do the opposite. You don't match your room to the speaker system, because then you'll be there all day. And if you're putting your speakers in something like a living room, you're going to have a nightmare trying to make the living room look nice at the same time, because you don't want acoustic absorption material all around your room. At the end of the day, we want to please the other half, as it were. Another term that you might have heard within hi-fi is, does a speaker sound lean or does it sound rich? This is another term that you might have heard, and in my opinion it relates to timbre. So if something has a leaner sound, it means that the edges of the sound perhaps are more clearly defined, perhaps the bass is tighter as well, more controlled. But if something sounds too lean, perhaps these attributes are to a point that sound too unnatural and not nice to listen to. Almost like the life of the music got sucked out of it. To make things a little bit more complicated, there are some cases where you might have a speaker that's on the warm side, but at the same time it might be a little bit lean, which is a bit weird. From my recent experience, I tested the Kef LS50s, and there were some frequencies, it was pretty hard to define whether it was warmer or brighter. Overall, I think perhaps it's a bit brighter, but there are some frequencies that are on the warm side. They're a bit below neutral. But I would definitely say that the Kef LS50 is leaning more towards the lean side. I wouldn't call it a rich sounding speaker personally. So what determines a rich sound? Well, the way I put it is a rich sound, it might translate more into more of a romantic sound, more of an expressive sound. The individual notes, they might sound like they are fuller in texture and they have more depth to them. You might describe the richness of the note as being like fat and thin. That's another way. The difficulty I found is Sometimes you can have a very rich sounding system, but at the same time, the system can lose control of all the other attributes. And you'll find this a lot in poorer systems. So you have to find a good balance between the richness being there and the leanness being there too. So, you know, that's just something that I've personally experienced, and you might have too. Let me know in the comments below. So, did you enjoy the comparisons that I made between hi-fi systems and musical instruments? If you did or you didn't, let me know in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts. You've been watching Man Discovers Hi-Fi, and I will see you in the next video.